Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. For those of you that are interested in learning how to make some kind of a cloud-based game, more of like a strategy game, for free without needing to know how to code, stay tuned. I'm covering the basics in today's video. Now, before we get started, don't forget to like and subscribe and check out the channel for new content. All right, so jumping straight in, as I'm sure you've noticed by now, we are using AppGyver and we are using the Community Edition, which at the time of filming this video is free. So basically what we're going to be doing is making a strategy game. Now you may be wondering, okay, why do we have this chat window set up? So I'll walk you through that really quickly. In a previous video, I made a chat app and I actually put it up for free in the free downloads section right here in Codeless Fix. Now, if you would prefer to make this yourself, I have a video which I will link in the description where I walk through building this out start to finish. It is entirely up to you, but it was just a way to save you a little bit of time. So basically what we have, and all that I've done up until this point, is just update a couple of things. So we have these pages here, and that's really it. So the first thing that I did, if you click on this scroller or this toggle here, I clicked on project and updated the project in the right hand side with my project, which you can find in Firebase. Typically it's in the URL to the right of project. It's in between these two slashes. You can also find it in your settings. Then the next thing that I did was I went to the data tab, and then in each of these three sections here, I just updated the project in the URL right here. It should be the word project in all caps. Regardless, you're just going to find to the right of projects and match it just like you would right here. So you would do that for each of these three and save each. So once you've set up the data and then you've set up the variable, the only remaining thing that you really need to make sure you update is when you go to the auth tab. So from here, you'll have your authentication that should already be set up. So if it's not, you're going to want to go to configure Google Firebase. Yours should already be set up though. And you're going to want to fill out the configuration here under Android app configuration, under web app configuration, and then all of these pieces down here. It's pretty straightforward to do this if you haven't done it before. I have tons of video tutorials, including the one on actually making the chat app. The high-level overview is when you go to Project Settings and you scroll down. All of the web app configuration details are right here, and this is the actual web app ID, so everything you need is here. Then the next thing you would need is to add an app, and then if you're going to have an iOS app, you'll click this. Android app, you'll click that. You go through the setup, download the JSON file, and grab the remaining pieces of information, which you will then fill out in the corresponding areas in this configure page. So once you've done that, I would recommend waiting probably about a minute or two. I don't know why, but for some reason it didn't work right away for me. But then you can go to the launch test page and open preview portal. Now I already have it set up right here, and you'll see the app name right here, which is the app name right here. And really all that there is to it, I've just logged in. So I created 2 sample accounts in Firebase, and we're going to use those for this strategy game. Now, the reason we're setting this up the way that we are is this app already has a username section and a My Account page where you can set your own username. For a cloud-based game, you're going to need a way for people to connect with each other and access that game. Alright, so one thing I do want to note before jumping in, as I was kind of going through and realized the only major flaw with utilizing collections in Firebase is that currently there's no way to delete the collection or all of the documents contained within it. So going through the video, I am going to start out using a collection and creating multiple documents. However, the best way to do this is going to be to utilize the built-in functionality, which I'll show at the end of the video, and I will not be going through it in its entirety. So I'm going to be doing enough to get you started in this video. So basically what we're going to be using at the end of the video, and this is just a high-level overview, is we're going to be using 3 functions in AppGyver. First is going to be getRecord. Then we're going to be using createRecord, and then we're going to be using deleteRecord. So getRecord is going to be on page load. We're getting all the details from Firebase. Then we're going to be deleting the record, and then we're going to be creating a new record once everything's done. So we're going to get the record, populate everything, Then we're going to delete the record, and then we're going to create a new record. So instead, going through this video, you'll see I'm going to be using this get record collection. That would work if it were possible to delete all of the records within the collection. There's not currently an easy way to do that. So I want to preface this video by saying I'm not going to make this entire application by the end of the video, but I'm going to give you enough information and you should be able to utilize other tutorials I've made in order to be able to complete things. Would love to know your thoughts, but let's jump straight in. Now, once we've done that, the chat page is going to be where the game actually is being played. So you can name this page whatever you want. I'll just put play. And then we're going to change up this menu and the data that we're sending and receiving just a little bit. So we're going to go ahead and click save to save these changes. And then we're going to take this container. To reduce confusion, we are just going to delete it entirely. Now, what we're going to do next is we're going to focus on the actual game itself. Now, I'm going to do something simple, which I've done in a previous video, but you can modify this to make it really whatever you want within reason. So I'm going to make this a tic-tac-toe game, but if you wanted to play a game like maybe Connect 4, although that would be much more complex, or maybe something like Battleship, the idea is going to be the same. It's all about the data that you're sending and receiving and how it loads. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off with a pretty simple idea, and we're just going to make this tic-tac-toe game. So we're going to put a button here, and a button here. Now, one thing to note for this is if you wanted, you could use images or other options. Maybe you want to use some of the primitive elements. It's entirely up to you, but I'm just going to use buttons. And then in each button, we're going to have a label. So what we'll do is we're going to copy this, and I'm just going to paste it a couple of times. And then just to make things look a little cleaner, I'm going to put a little gap in here, and I'll put a gap up here. So things are looking okay so far. So now we're going to go to the page variables. So we have message and username. So I'm going to go ahead and add in 9 variables. Just by clicking this several times, it automatically names and increments the number. And these are going to be for each of the 9 buttons. And then we're going to add one more for current selection. So once you've done this, we're going to go through and assign the label to each of the individual buttons. So in this case, we're going to go to data variables, page variable, and variable 1. We are then going to repeat this process for each of these individual buttons. And the idea here is these page variables are going to be what's actually displayed for this game. So if you want complex logic that's going to do something like, say, who's the winner, who's the loser, any kind of point systems, you could implement something like that. It's going to be much easier now that this app is already set up with user accounts. So we won't really walk through that in this video, but it is something that you could think about. Just bear in mind, it's really easy to come up with a really, really big idea and then shortly after realize, okay, developing that kind of logic is going to be much more complex than I originally thought. An example is if you wanted Connect 4, you would have to think, okay, if someone clicks here, how do I have a dropping mechanism to allow the chip to drop down? Things like that would be difficult very, very quickly, if even possible. But we are wrapping up here. I think this one is actually variable 8. Another crucial thing, which isn't really difficult to do, but I would highly recommend making sure that you are double checking the work as you're doing it to make sure that you've selected the correct variables for everything. So this is correct. So we have all the variables. Now we're going to click save. And then we are going to go to the variables tab. And for each of these page variables, we are going to put an initial value. I just personally like to have a dash. And the reason for this, which you'll see momentarily, is just to give it a blank placeholder to let the user know, okay, this space is available. You could also make it something else if you want, but as you can see when we go to the chat page right now, they're just a bunch of blank bubbles, which is a little confusing. So now we're going to click save and just kind of see how much smoother it looks. So when I go to chat now, you'll see now we have these windows. Now, if you want to make it a little bit more appealing, you can go to each of your cells and you can go to the layout tab and set things up however you want. And then you can also go to the style tab and go to border. And what I like to do is for individual borders. So for example, we could set the right width and the bottom width to 5. And then what we'll do is make sure that we have the border style selected. So you'll see that we have a right width and a bottom width of 5. It may look a little odd, but as we go through, it'll start to make a little bit more sense. And again, you can take advantage of these borders really however you feel that you need to. But I'm going to have the bottom width as 5, and then the left width as 5. And then here, we will edit as well. And another thing that you could take advantage of when working with this is, if you're interested, you could look into modifying the actual behavior when you click on things. So when you go to properties, there's a couple of different options that you could take advantage of in the logic to change things up. For example, if you wanted to adjust what happens when you click on something, there are options for that as well. But what we're going to do here, so we have gaps that we are going to want to change. So we're going to go to the individual rows and change these gaps and make these a little bit closer. And then we're going to go into each of these individual rows and go to the cells and repeat the process so that we can create what basically appears to be a tic-tac-toe board. So again, you can go through the style and make any other changes that you want, but really for this, all that we're focusing on is going to be the border. So what we'll do here is this one is going to need a bottom border. And then it's going to need a right width as well. And if you ever notice that nothing's appearing on your screen, it's because you haven't set your border style yet. Then we will go to cell 2, edit. We'll try to make this as quick as possible because I'm sure it makes plenty of sense. So we're going to need right and we're going to need bottom. And then cell 3, pretty straightforward, edit, same process, border. And for this one, we just need the bottom. And then lastly, the good thing here is if you want to speed things up just a bit, you should be able to go to the middle cell. And when you go to edit, you in theory would just need to go solid. And then when you go to the individual borders, you should just need left and right. And then we'll click save and go over here and see what things look like now. So now when we go to the chat page, not the most appealing, you could work things out and change it a little bit. For example, if instead of buttons, you wanted to change the individual cell colors, you could do that. But for now, it works. Each of these buttons just does what it does. So the next critical thing is to actually make the move itself. So for this, we aren't going to need the messages field. We're just going to need the send button. So in this case, you will need to choose what player are you. So what we're going to do is scroll through here, and I think that the easiest route to do it, you could try to do a kind of like a toggle, but I think it's going to be easier if we just go with a row here, and then we do a button and another button. And here we can choose X, and here we can choose O. And these will be the player options. So once you have these two selected, we'll click save. And the idea is you would click a button, click the place, click send, it would do it. So it's relatively straightforward. So we could do it that way. Or if you want, you could remove the send button and just have it go when you select space, but again, you want it to be a little bit more intuitive just so players can't play on top of each other's pieces or anything like that. And if you ever get these failure to saves, just wait a couple seconds and you can usually just save it again after that. So looking at this on a full screen device, everything looks like it's making sense right now. So again, you can decide what's the best logic for you in that moment in time. All right, so what we're going to do from here is we are going to start setting up this logic to actually send the data. So the first part of the app, obviously, when you load the page, you need to load everything that's in this table. But right now we can't load anything because A, there's nothing to load, and B, we don't have a schema set to actually break down into this table. So what we're going to do first is go to the send button and look at the logic. So you'll see it's an HTTP request to this URL here. Now you may be wondering, how do we know which user or setup it's going to be? Like, how do we know which chat? Because if we have 20 friends, how are we going to load things based on each individual game, so to speak? So you'll see if you go to the Find People page, there's logic to set up a game, so to speak, or a chat. And it'll set it up based on a couple of different options of rearranging the individuals' names. So the idea is there are only two possible combinations: your username and their username, or their username and your username. So that's what this is going to be setting up. So what we're going to do here is when we go to send, what we need to adjust is basically just going to be the data in the request body. So all we really need is going to be the actual buttons or the variables. So the idea here is if we have a user selecting X or a user selecting O, we need to make sure that that variable is sent to Firebase along with all of the other current values. If we leave a value blank like this, or if we leave it off completely, it's likely going to be erasing all of that data in its entirety. So we're going to want to send all of the data plus the user response, and then get all of the data after it's done. All right, so the values here are basically what is contained within this section right here. So you'll see that we have a field called chat, which contains this, and a field called username, which contains this. So to clean things up a bit, I'll name this 1, and then we'll have the page variable, variable 1. And then we will name this one 2, and this will be page variable 2. And the idea here is we will just continue this until we end up with all of our variables, and we'll throw in an extra one for good measure. So we will paste this in a couple of times, and then we will name this 3, and again, we'll just continue this trend until we have all 9, and then we'll want to have an extra one for, let's just say, the selected variable, just in case. I don't think it's something that we're actually going to end up needing. We'll see how we end up doing the logic for this. And you're going to want to make sure that you're copying this correctly. I get a lot of comments of people asking how to break down the API calls or saying that their API calls aren't working. And it's usually something like this where you just haven't formatted things correctly. So we'll make this one, we'll just call it extra. Never hurts to have something just in case. So you'll see we have a page variable, and we'll just send current selection as the extra. So basically what we've done is we've added in page variables 1 through 9, and that corresponds to these values here. Now what we're going to do is each of these we're going to set to be a certain value. Now, you'll see that this one is X and this one is O. So for X, what we're going to do is we're basically going to say current selection. So this is going to be set page variable, current selection. It's actually done by default. And the assigned value is going to be X. And then for this one, you'll see it's O. So we will set the page variable to O. And this is relatively straightforward. The idea is what we're doing right now, or the way that this is currently set up, when a user clicks this, their player or current selection variable is now X. When they click this button, nothing happens. But when they click this button, it's going to be sending all of the variables off to Firebase. So at least we're going to have a table populate. So now let's go over to Firestore Database. And we're going to go to our chat app, and let's just click send and see if anything comes through. Now, usually if you're creating a brand new collection, you would need to go ahead and refresh the page. You'll see that we have undefined, which is expected because we haven't set up our usernames. That's a relatively simple fix. So if we type in 4 A's and click set username, and then we go back to the chat, you'll see that when we click send, now when we go over here and click refresh, we should have another one, bearing in mind a couple of things. First and foremost, it is important to note that you need a username on both ends. So for example, if I have the 4 letter A's, for example, right here, but I don't have the other one, which is the second user account, it's still not going to actually end up creating anything. So that is one quick thing to note. So it's still probably going to end up coming through here, but at least we're getting the data, which is what we want. So now what we need to do is make sure that we're actually sending the data as expected, but we will also need a separate account so that we can switch back and forth between the two, as currently I'm logged into one. So we have our username set up. Now when we're sending the data, we're sending everything. So now what we need to do is we need to enable the user to actually make a selection. So this is where the variable and data comes in. So we've already assigned the variables. So now what we need to do is if this button is selected, we need to set the page variable, and we'll click this. And then you'll see that we could set it by default, but we need to make an if condition. The reason for this is if we just set the variable, we're not factoring in what the user's selected. So if we drag this over and connect this here, you'll see we have if condition 1, and you may be thinking, okay, well, what about if it's not 1, for example, or if it's not X? That's if condition 2. So you have 2 different ways to set this up. If you have more complex games, you would want kind of like a cascading if condition. So the idea here is if condition 1, and what we're going to do is we're going to go to formula, and we're going to go to page variable, and we're going to put current selection, and then we're going to put X. Or you may need to put X in quotes like this. So if it's X, then we're going to set the page variable, and then in this case, we're setting the variable for variable 1, and we're going to assign it X. Or the second if condition is going to be the same exact thing, but in this case, we are going to be setting the value equal to, I'm sure you guessed it, O. So if the second one is O, then we're going to set the page variable, and then we're going to set variable 1, and we're going to set it to O. So this would be perfectly fine for more complex logic, because then you can continue the if conditions if you want. I'm going to simplify things just a bit because there are only 2 choices. So if the current selection is X, it's going to set variable 1 to X. Otherwise, it's going to set variable 1 to O. And then I'm going to copy this. Now, bear in mind, if a user hasn't made a selection, it's also going to make this true, so you do need to pay attention to your logic. I'm doing this just for the sake of getting this process finished. So we're going to copy this exact same logic, and we're going to repeat it, but just swap out variable 2 for button 2, go to button 3, and repeat the process. And all this is doing is just allowing us to select each individual button as a user. And again, we will continue to repeat the process. So we have current selection, and we're just going to make this variable 4. And you don't have to deal with letters if you wanted to. You could assign numbers instead, like 1, 2, 3, instead of X and O. It's entirely up to you how you prefer to kind of manage that. And we'll just try to run through this as quickly as possible. I like to try to save here and there just to make sure you don't end up losing any work. And another thing that you're going to want to do, just try to think about things in advance when you're building things like this, because as you can see, copying and pasting makes this so much quicker than if you were trying to make this every single time. If you can make something repeatable, it is going to drastically reduce the amount of time that you're spending working on your apps. And in this case, you'll see, you can kind of see, obviously, I'm making some missteps because it's really easy to get stuck in a specific series of motions. So we got variable 8. And then up last for the difficult logic is variable 9. So we're going to set variable 9. And the last thing that I'm going to recommend is that you test this out. This is much more simple logic. If you wanted to make something like a much more complex game, that would obviously be a different story. But if we select X, I want to make sure, as you can see, that's obviously not correct. And then if we select O, so obviously that's not working as expected. So this is exactly why you would want to make sure that that's working correctly. So let's check this logic out real quick. We're setting current selection to X. And you'll see right there, obviously that might be a simple mistake. Let's just make sure it's case sensitive. So as you can see, that fixed it. So you're going to need to make sure that you're using case-sensitive options, but we're going to go through and make sure that the correct buttons are changing, which they are. So that's very, very simple. Now what we can do is we can click send and see if anything comes through. So you'll see in this case, we have data coming through, which means if we were to refresh this page, we should be getting the exact same data. So we're going to log in as our user real quick, and click login and go to our chat. Now, in this case, if it's not setting things up as expected, so you'll see we have our current user and we go to this page in particular, it's also because we don't have a second user set up. So let's go ahead and do that really quickly. We have username AAA, so we'll type that in and click add, and you'll see it says added, and that user is now here. So we'll refresh the page, log out, and log in as our second user. And go to login. And go to account and set username. And we'll just set 4 ones. And then you'll see changes saved. So now we're going to go to people. We're going to add AAAA. Wait for that to appear here. And then we will refresh the page and log back into the original account. And the idea for this is relatively simple. When we go to people, we're going to add the 4 ones. So now we have our friends list. Obviously, you don't need to add yourself, but if we click here, you'll see it's going to say start chat. So this should create one with 4 A's and 4 ones. So let's refresh here and see what happens. So you'll see here we have chat 1111, AAAA, I think A. So it's been set up, and now we just need to, we'll just do a sample send just to see if it updates it. So you'll see The newest one is right here. So now let's try to change up some data really quickly. So we're going to add in some O's. Let's add in an X and an X and click send. And you'll see that it is now sending that data through, but it is giving it a unique name every single time. But at the very least, that part is working as expected, which is good. Now we need to see if we can log in as the other user. But first, obviously, we need to go ahead and set this up correctly, because the original messaging app, each of these would be a message, which is not going to be the case here. We are only going to need one. So in this case, we can go to the send button and we can go to the HTTP request, and you'll see that it's going to set up the chat name based on the name of the selected person. So we can go ahead and try to modify this to create some consistency in the naming. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to set up the data collection. So you have a couple of choices. If you want, you can use AppGyver's functionality for get record, create record, update record. Instead, what I'm going to do is try to work with what we already have within this application. So first thing we need to do is when the page loads, we need to display all the data. Sending the data is great, but if we don't know what the other user is doing or what the last move was, then we can't really actually play this game. So you'll see currently we are getting some data on page load, but first thing we need to do is work with this new schema. Now, we don't need all of these documents, but we do need them in a moment just to get this sample data, and then we can clear them out. So when we go to chats, you'll see we have this set up currently, and you'll see we have an ID here. This is so that it could be dynamic. So if we click on static text, we can enter in 1, 2, 3, 4 ones and then 4 A's and click run test. And you'll see that we have some sample data. So what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to delete a couple of these. So in this case, I have a couple of different options. So we're going to delete document and click start delete. And then we're going to repeat this process a couple of times in Firebase so that we are left with only one document. And that's going to be this one here. So now we're going to go back here and we're going to run test one more time. And we are going to set schema from response. And then we can go ahead and click save and save. Now we're going to go make sure that in this case that ID is not saved, because that ID is going to change based on the user that's actually playing. So now what we can do is we have some sample data to work with. So when our page loads, you'll see that we are getting the record here. Now we can also go to get record collection. So when this first one is completed, you can actually go from this set page variable and go to get record collection, and we're going to go to chats, and the ID is going to be just like we were setting up here. So we are going to try to get a different chat record collection. So it's chats, and then obviously we need to have the data variable page parameter for a selected person. And then we can go ahead and try to set some page variables. So we're going to go drag this over. And when you move this here, you should be able to go to your page variable, and we're going to select variable 1, assigned value output of another node. And you'll see we have get record collection, but it's showing incompatible. So as a workaround, we can click here and go to formula, and you can type in the word output, and you'll see we have a bunch of different options. So we have field 1, field 2, field 3, field 4, all the way through, and we just want the string value for field 1. And you'll see it has a sample value, and we can actually copy this. So we're setting variable 1 to the selected string value. So we can actually copy and paste, and we can do this multiple times. And the idea here is we are doing this for each of the given page variables. So page variables 1 through 9. So as you can see, we have a couple here. We just need a couple more. And then it's up to you how you prefer to do it. I just string them this way. That way, when one completes successfully, it'll trigger the next one. but you can figure that out based on the performance of your app. So we'll go through, get all these together, and then we will go through and just change out from variable 1 to variable 2. And it's entirely up to you how you do this, because we also have to change the text here. I like to kind of get into a zone of, all right, going through 4, then 5, so it's up to you. You could do both at the same time if you prefer. I've just found that this is quicker for my workflow. And then we have 7, 8, 9. So we'll go to 7. 8. And then 9. So what this is going to do is go to that record collection, get it, and repeat the process. So we have 1 through 9. Now we have to change the output from 1, which actually this one we don't need to change. This is the first one. But the second one we do need to change. So here we'll just change it to 2. And as I'm sure you guessed, we're repeating this process. 3. 4, and you're just going to do this for all of them. And this is why the naming convention is so important. This will really help you out when it comes to figuring out, okay, which is which. How do I assign my values? If you don't set your names in a way that makes sense in the beginning, then when you go through and you have issues and your variables aren't matching up, it's going to be much harder to figure out from that point. Then we have variable 9. So we're going to click save and save. Now, as a test, because we only have this chat here, let's go to our chat. And you'll see that right now, nothing is loaded. So let's go back home. We'll click on 1111. And now you'll see something has loaded here. So our app variables reset. So that's probably all there was to it. So now let's try something really, really quickly. And we know that this isn't going to work because when we click send, it's now going to create a new document. So it is sending the correct data, but the problem now becomes, how is it going to read it? Is it going to pull from this document or this one? Because we're pulling from the entire collection and we have random document names. So in this case, you'll see that it is technically working in that I can go back to people and click here. But now it doesn't know what to pull, and it's just pulling this first collection here. It's not pulling the most recent. So if you want, you can use AppGyver's built-in functionality, and instead of using an entire collection, you can just go through and you can get the record individually if you choose to actually name them when you create them. All right, so basically wrapping things up here, because obviously we would have to modify a good bit more functionality, but I think we have the bulk of this kind of built out. So right now we are posting all of the data as we would expect, but it's creating all of these documents. Unfortunately, there's no command that we could easily utilize to delete this chat session. So we have a couple of choices. You could either create a new one every single time, which probably wouldn't be ideal, or you can learn to create the record and then delete the record. So what I will leave you with at this point is you can go from all of this data and utilize the create record function. So right here, you'll see that we are getting the record collection for chats. Instead, what you could work to do is you could scroll through and you can use the get record, and then you can use create record, and you can use delete record. So when the page loads, you'll get the record and you'll specify the ID here, similar to what we've done with chats, for example. You'll get that record. Then you will do exactly what we've done here, set all the page variables. Then at the very end, you would use this delete record in place of this. And then when the user goes forward and clicks send, instead of this data request, you can use the create record option. Now, when you do each of these, a couple of things to note. When you go to your data tab and you go to your chats, you have to make sure that each of these are enabled. So when you go to, for example, delete record, this is not enabled, so you won't be able to adjust it. Or if you wanted to create a record, this is not enabled. When I select this, you'll configure this for your Firebase settings. And I have other videos on how to actually work through creating records and things of that nature. So when you've enabled that, now when we go to create record, and once we've configured it, we will be able to adjust this further. So if we go to data, chats, create record, and we enable this, you can put / let's just say ID, and we'll work through the high level basics. And then you'll see we need an HTTP header, or actually in this case, we don't need the header. We need a placeholder because we need to specify what's what. So if we typed in ID, and it's not going to be static, and then we save, you should now be able to go to this create record function, set your ID, set any record properties. For example, if you wanted to work with the properties, since we've already set the schema, you can choose what values are being posted. So the idea here is pretty simple. On page layout, you are going to get, and you're, instead of the actual get record collection, you're going to get the individual record, select the record here, and then set all of your page variables, and then you're going to delete the record. And now we have an empty record, and then we will go in and we will create a new one instead of this post request here. And we will just select those record properties, again, making sure that you've configured each of these correctly here. So I hope this was helpful. I know I didn't walk through everything like I normally would, but it would be a much lengthier video. If you have any questions, drop them in the comment box below, and I'll see you all in the next video.